The dust from their stones still stung her cheek when Grace Wallace heard the thunder of hooves behind her, and she stumbled forward on the rutted road leading out of Placitas, New Mexico, one hand clutching her swollen belly and the other gripping the handle of her battered carpetbag. She had been married for only 8 months before Samuel died in a mining accident, and now his brother and the town council had deemed her unworthy of remaining in their righteous community. The accusations had come swift and merciless, whispered at first in the mercantile and the church, then shouted from the steps of the town hall. They claimed Samuel had never properly married her, that she was nothing more than a harlot carrying a bastard child, and that decent folk could not tolerate such sin in their midst. Her legs trembled with exhaustion as she forced herself onward beneath the brutal August sun of 1878. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the injustice of their exile. She was 6 months along, showing clearly now, and the walk from town had already drained what little strength she possessed. The morning had begun with fists pounding on her door, then rough hands dragging her from the small cabin Samuel had built. She had barely managed to grab her belongings before they shoved her into the street. The sound of hooves grew louder, and panic seized her heart. Were they coming back to finish what they started? She glanced over her shoulder, squinting against the glare, and saw a single rider approaching fast. The horse was a magnificent chestnut stallion, and the man sat tall in the saddle, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. Grace's breath caught. She had nowhere to run, no strength left to flee. Her knees buckled and she sank to the ground, arms wrapped protectively around her middle. The rider pulled up beside her in a cloud of dust, and she heard the creak of leather as he dismounted. Boots appeared in her line of vision, well-worn but quality made, and then a strong hand touched her shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Madam, are you hurt?" The voice was deep and concerned, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. Grace looked up slowly, her vision blurred with tears and dust. The man crouching beside her was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of sage. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and his jaw was strong beneath several days' worth of stubble. There was something solid and dependable in his bearing, like an old oak that had weathered countless storms. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice cracked. "Just tired." His gaze moved to her belly, then to the carpetbag, and finally to the fresh bruise forming on her cheek. His jaw tightened. "You're coming from Placitas," she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Let me guess. The good Christian folk decided you weren't welcome anymore." There was an edge of bitterness in his tone that suggested he had his own grievances with the town. "They said I was never properly married," Grace whispered. "That I'm carrying a child in sin. But that's not true. Samuel and I were married by the circuit preacher last October. We had witnesses and everything. But the town clerk claims there's no record of it, and Samuel's brother wants our land. He convinced everyone that I'm lying." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if weighing the truth of her words. Then he stood and extended his hand. "My name is Frank Jameson. I own a ranch about 15 miles west of here. You look like you could use water, food, and a place to rest. Will you accept my help?" Grace stared at his outstretched hand. She had learned to be wary of men who offered help with nothing asked in return, but something in Frank Jameson's steady gaze told her he was different. Besides, what choice did she have? The nearest town was days away on foot, and she would not survive the journey in her condition. "Grace Wallace," she said, placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, and he pulled her to her feet with easy strength. "I don't want charity, Mr. Jameson. If you have work I can do, I'll earn my keep." A slight smile touched his lips. "We'll figure something out. Right now, let's just get you out of this heat." He helped her onto his horse, settling her in the saddle before swinging up behind her. Grace tensed at the sudden proximity, but Frank kept a respectful distance, one arm loosely around her waist to steady her as they rode. The motion of the horse was surprisingly soothing after the harsh jolting of her forced march, and Grace found herself relaxing against Frank's solid chest despite her better judgment. "You said Samuel died in a mining accident," Frank said after they had ridden in silence for several minutes. "Was it the collapse at the Silver Star last spring?" "Yes. He was one of 12 men who died that day. They barely recovered the bodies." The memory still brought fresh pain. "We had been so happy. He was saving money to expand our cabin before the baby came. And then in one moment, everything was gone. I'm sorry for your loss. I knew Samuel a little. He was a good man, always fair in his dealings. He bought cattle from me once or twice." The kindness in Frank's voice threatened to break through the walls Grace had built around her grief. She blinked back tears, determined not to fall apart in front of this stranger, no matter how compassionate he seemed. The landscape rolled past, all sagebrush and red rock formations that glowed in the afternoon light. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. It was beautiful country, harsh but honest, and Grace felt a strange sense of hope stirring beneath her fear and exhaustion. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." "For all you know, everything the town says about me could be true." Frank was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "About 5 years ago, I was in a bad way. My parents had died within months of each other, leaving me with a ranch I barely knew how to run and debts I couldn't pay. The bank was ready to foreclose, and I was about ready to give up. Then a man I'd never met before showed up at my door and offered me a loan, no interest, paid back whenever I could manage it. He said someone had helped him once when he needed it, and he was passing the kindness forward. That money saved my ranch, so I figure I owe the world a good turn or two." "Did you ever pay him back?" "Every cent, plus interest he wouldn't accept. He used the money to help someone else, said that's how it works. You keep the chain going." Frank shifted in the saddle. "Besides, I don't much care for bullies, and I especially don't care for men who would chase a pregnant woman out into the desert. You're under my protection now, Mrs. Wallace. Nobody's going to hurt you while you're on my land." The simple declaration sent a wave of relief through Grace so powerful that she had to bite her lip to keep from sobbing. For the first time since Samuel's death, she felt safe. It was a fragile feeling, one she did not quite trust yet, but it was there nonetheless. They rode over a rise, and Frank's ranch came into view. It was more substantial than Grace had expected, a sprawling operation with a large main house built of adobe and timber, several outbuildings and extensive corrals. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and she could see men working near the barns. Everything spoke of prosperity and careful management. "It's beautiful," Grace said softly. "It's home," Frank replied, and there was pride in his voice. "My grandfather built the original house back in 1850. My father expanded it, and I've done my share of improvements. The land is good here, plenty of water from the creek that runs through the property. We run about 1,000 head of cattle, plus horses." As they approached the main house, a door opened and a woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern as she took in Grace's disheveled appearance. "Frank Jameson, what have you gotten yourself into now?" she called, hands on her hips. "Found her on the road from Placida's, Rosa. The town ran her out." Frank dismounted and reached up to help Grace down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "This is Mrs. Grace Wallace. Grace, this is Rosa Martinez. She keeps this place running and makes sure I don't starve. She and her husband Miguel have been with my family since before I was born." Rosa's expression softened as she looked Grace over. "Mater de Dios, those fools. Come inside, child. You look ready to drop." She turned and called through the door. "Miguel, bring water." Grace found herself ushered into a spacious kitchen that was blissfully cool after the heat outside. Rosa settled her into a chair at a large wooden table and pressed a cup of water into her hands. Grace drank gratefully, then accepted a second cup when the first disappeared in moments. An older man appeared, weathered and lean, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Miguel Martinez," Grace assumed. He nodded to her politely before turning to Frank. "The men are asking about the fence line on the north pasture. Want me to tell them to wait until tomorrow?" "No, I'll go talk to them in a few minutes." Frank pulled out a chair across from Grace. "Rosa, can you prepare the guest room? Mrs. Wallace will be staying with us for a while." "Of course." Rosa was already bustling around the kitchen, assembling food on a plate. "How far along are you, child?" "6 months, madam. And they drove you out in this condition. Shameful." Rosa set a plate of bread, cheese, and cold meat in front of Grace, followed by a bowl of soup that smelled of chicken and herbs. "Eat. You need your strength." Grace wanted to protest that she was fine, that she did not need such attention, but her stomach growled loudly enough to make further denial pointless. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as her body reminded her that she had not eaten since the previous evening. The food was delicious, simple but perfectly prepared, and Grace felt strength returning with each bite. Frank watched her eat with what seemed like satisfaction. "Rosa, see if you can find some clothes that might fit her, and she'll need proper boots. Those shoes won't last another day." "Already planning on it." Rosa refilled Grace's water cup. "When you're done eating, I'll show you to your room. You need rest." "I need to work," Grace countered, though exhaustion was pulling at her. "Mr. Jameson said I could earn my keep." Frank leaned back in his chair. "First rule of this ranch, Mrs. Wallace. When Rosa says you need rest, you rest. We can talk about work arrangements later after you've recovered from whatever hell you went through this morning. For now, consider yourself a guest." Grace wanted to argue, but another massive yawn overtook her and Rosa clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Come along, child. Let's get you settled." The guest room was small but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. A window looked out over the ranch yard, and Grace could see the mountains in the distance, painted gold by the late afternoon sun. Rosa helped her out of her dusty dress and into a clean nightgown, then turned down the bed. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it, and the privy is just out back, though there's a chamber pot under the bed for nighttime. If you need anything, just call. My room is right next door." Rosa paused at the door. "Frank is a good man, Mrs. Wallace. He won't take advantage of your situation. You're safe here." "Thank you," Grace whispered, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. Rosa smiled. "Get some rest. Things will look better in the morning." But Grace lay awake for a long time after Rosa left, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been homeless and terrified, facing an uncertain future alone. Now she was in a comfortable bed, in a safe place, with a full stomach and people who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. It felt too good to be true, and she could not shake the fear that it would all be snatched away. The baby kicked again, a strong flutter against her ribs, and Grace placed her hand over the spot. "We're going to be all right. she whispered to her unborn child. Somehow, we're going to be all right. Through the open window, she heard the low murmur of voices and the sounds of the ranch settling in for the evening. Somewhere a horse whinnied, and a dog barked once before falling silent. It was peaceful in a way Grace had not experienced in months, not since before Samuel died. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion finally claim her. She woke once in the night, disoriented and afraid until she remembered where she was. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting everything silver, and she could hear the distant call of a coyote. Grace rose awkwardly and made her way to the window, looking out over the ranch. A light burned in one of the outbuildings, and she could just make out a figure moving inside. Frank, perhaps, doing late-night work, or one of the ranch hands. She thought about the man who had rescued her, trying to reconcile his kindness with her experience of men. Samuel had been kind too, gentle and loving, but he had been the exception among the rough miners and ranchers she had known. Most men she encountered were either indifferent or predatory, seeing women as property or objects for their use. But Frank Jameson seemed different. There had been nothing but respect in his manner, no hint of expectations beyond basic civility. Grace returned to bed and slept deeply until dawn, when the sounds of the ranch coming to life filtered through her window. She rose and washed using the pitcher and basin, then dressed in her own clothes, wishing she had something cleaner to wear. When she emerged from her room, she found Rosa already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for what was clearly a small army. "Good morning," Rosa said cheerfully. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Grace admitted. "Can I help? You can set the table." "The men will be in soon, hungry as bears." Rosa nodded toward a cupboard. "Plates and cups are in there. We'll need settings for 8. Grace set to work, grateful for something useful to do. As she arranged plates and silverware, ranch hands began filing in, removing their hats and washing up at a basin near the door. They were a rough-looking bunch, weathered and hard-muscled, but they nodded politely to Grace and took their seats without comment. Frank was the last to arrive, his hair damp as if he had dunked his head in the water trough. "Morning, Mrs. Wallace," he said, taking a seat at the head of the table. "Hope you found everything comfortable." "Very much so, thank you." Breakfast was a substantial affair of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy, served with strong coffee and fresh milk. The men ate with focused efficiency, exchanging few words but clearly appreciating Rosa's cooking. Grace ate more modestly, still not quite comfortable in this new environment, but she listened carefully to the conversation. The ranch hands discussed work for the day, fence repairs and cattle movements, a problem with one of the wells, a horse that needed shoeing. Frank listened and offered direction with quiet authority, and it was clear that his men respected him. There was no harshness in his manner, no bullying or intimidation, just clear communication and fair delegation. After breakfast, the men dispersed to their tasks and Frank lingered over his coffee. "Mrs. Wallace, if you're feeling up to it, I'd like to discuss your situation." Grace nodded, her stomach tightening with anxiety. Here it came, the price for his kindness. Frank must have seen something in her expression because he held up a hand. "Nothing bad, I promise. I just want to understand what you're facing and how I can best help." They moved to a small office off the main room, a cluttered space filled with ledgers and papers. Frank cleared a chair for Grace and sat behind his desk. "Tell me exactly what happened in Placitas. Start from the beginning." Grace took a deep breath and told him everything. How she had met Samuel in the spring of 1877 when he came into the restaurant where she worked. How they had courted properly for 6 months before marrying, with the ceremony performed by circuit preacher Thomas Reynolds, who visited the mining camps and small towns throughout the territory. how they had built a life together in those few short months of marriage, planning for a future that seemed bright despite the hard work and danger of mining. Then Samuel's death, the grief and shock of it, and the slow realization that she was pregnant. At first, the town had been sympathetic. But then Samuel's brother, Robert Wallace, had started making claims to the cabin and the small savings Samuel had left. When Grace refused to leave, Robert had gone to the town clerk and convinced him to claim there was no record of her marriage. Without the circuit preacher to confirm the ceremony, and with Robert producing witnesses who swore they had never seen Grace and Samuel properly wed, the town council had sided with him. "They gave me a week to leave town voluntarily," Grace said, her voice shaking with remembered fear. But this morning, they decided a week was too long. Robert and 3 other men came to the cabin and dragged me out. They threw my things in the street and said if I wasn't gone by noon, they would have the sheriff arrest me for vagrancy and trespassing. Some of the women threw stones as I left. Frank's expression had grown darker as she spoke. "This circuit preacher, Thomas Reynolds, do you know where he might be now? He travels throughout New Mexico and Arizona. I heard he might be in Santa Fe this time of year, but I'm not certain." "And you're sure he would remember performing your marriage?" "I think so. He stayed for dinner afterward and we talked for hours. He was a kind man, very educated. He gave us a marriage certificate, but it was in the cabin when they threw me out. I don't know if Robert destroyed it or kept it." Frank drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking. "Here's what I propose. You stay here as long as you need to, no questions asked. You're welcome through the birth of your baby and beyond until you're strong enough to decide what you want to do next. In exchange, you can help Rosa with the household work, whatever you're comfortable doing in your condition." Does that seem fair? It seemed more than fair. It seemed too good to be true. "Mr. Jameson, I don't understand why you're doing this. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to let bullies win." Frank's expression softened. "Look, Mrs. Wallace, Grace, if I may, I know what it's like to face hard times alone. I know what it's like when the whole world seems to be against you, and I know how much difference one person's kindness can make. Let me be that person for you, no strings attached. All I ask is that someday when you're able you do the same for someone else." Grace felt tears welling up and blinked them back fiercely. "You don't even know if my story is true. What if I'm lying about everything? Are you?" "No." "Then that's all I need to know." Frank stood and extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Grace stood as well and shook his hand, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip. "We have a deal. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I won't forget this kindness." "Frank, if you're going to be living under my roof, we might as well be on first-name terms." He smiled, and Grace was struck by how it transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and making him look younger. "Now, I need to get to work. Rosa will show you around and get you settled into a routine. Take it easy for the first few days. You've been through hell." Over the next week, Grace gradually settled into life on the ranch. Rosa put her to work with light tasks, mending clothes, preparing vegetables, helping with laundry. The work was satisfying in a way that made Grace feel useful without overwhelming her limited energy. Rosa was good company, full of stories about the ranch and the Jameson family, and she had a gentle way of correcting Grace's mistakes without making her feel foolish. The ranch hands were respectful but distant, clearly unsure how to interact with a pregnant widow. Only Miguel made an effort to speak with her beyond basic greetings, and Grace appreciated his kindness. He showed her the garden Rosa tended, taught her which herbs were used for cooking and which for medicine, and explained the daily rhythms of ranch life. Frank was often away during the day, working with the cattle or riding the property line, but he always returned for dinner. He was not a talkative man, but he had a dry sense of humor that occasionally surfaced, and Grace found herself looking forward to their evening meals. He asked about her day, listened attentively when she spoke, and gradually she began to relax around him. One evening, about 10 days after her arrival, Frank returned looking troubled. Grace was helping Rosa clean up after dinner when he asked if he could speak with her privately. They went out to the porch, where the evening air was cooling after another scorching day. "I was in Placida's today," Frank said without preamble. "Talked to some people about your situation." Grace's heart sank. "Are they demanding I come back?" "No, nothing like that, but I wanted to get a sense of how things stand legally." He leaned against the porch rail, his expression serious. "The situation is not good. Without the marriage certificate or the circuit preacher to testify, you don't have much legal standing. Robert Wallace has claimed the cabin and all of Samuel's property. He's also spreading stories that could damage your reputation further." "What kind of stories?" "That you seduced Samuel into a false marriage, that you're trying to claim property that isn't yours, that the baby might not even be Samuel's." Frank's voice was tight with anger. "It's all lies, but he's got people believing him." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the warm evening. "So there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that. I think we need to find Circuit Preacher Reynolds and get his testimony. With that, we can challenge Robert's claims and possibly recover your property. But it will take time and money, and there's no guarantee of success." "I don't have money for lawyers." "I do." Frank held up a hand when Grace started to protest. "Before you argue, think about it. This isn't just about you, it's about what's right. Samuel worked hard for what he had, and he meant for it to go to you and your child. Letting his brother steal it because you don't have the resources to fight back would be wrong. I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Frank's tone was firm. "Grace, I've been thinking about this a lot over the past week. Your situation bothers me more than I can say, not just because it's unjust, but because it represents everything that's wrong with how we treat women in this territory. You should have rights. You should have protection under the law. The fact that you don't, simply because some men decided to ignore your marriage, is unconscionable." Grace studied his face in the fading light. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and pained. "I had a sister once, Emily. She was younger than me by 5 years, sweet and trusting. When she was 18, she fell in love with a man who promised to marry her. He got her pregnant and then denied everything, claimed she was a loose woman who had been with multiple men. Our parents were dead by then, and I was struggling to keep the ranch afloat. I didn't have the time or resources to fight for her properly. The town turned against her, and she ended up leaving in shame. I got a letter from her a year later, saying she was working in a boarding house in Kansas City. Then nothing. I've been trying to find her for 3 years now with no success." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. "That must be terrible, not knowing. It's my biggest regret. I should have done more, fought harder, protected her better." So when I see a woman in a similar situation, someone being persecuted for the crime of trusting a man who died before he could defend her honor, I can't just stand by. Maybe helping you is a way of making amends for failing my sister." Grace reached out and touched his arm, a brief gesture of sympathy. "I'm sure you did everything you could for her. Sometimes circumstances are just too much to overcome." "Maybe." Frank straightened, shaking off the dark mood. "But this time, circumstances are not going to win. We're going to find that preacher, get your marriage confirmed, and make Robert Wallace answer for what he's done. It might take a while, but we'll get there. And in the meantime, you're safe here. Your baby will be born here if needed, and you'll have a home as long as you want it." He met her eyes directly. "I give you my word on that, Grace. Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Grace's eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them. "You're a good man, Frank Jameson, better than I deserve. You deserve a lot more than the hand life has dealt you." He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. "Now stop crying before Rosa thinks I've been mean to you. She already lectures me enough about my manners." Grace laughed through her tears and wiped her eyes. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night sounds of the ranch surrounded them, peaceful and reassuring, and Grace felt something she had not experienced in a long time. Not just safety or gratitude, but a glimmer of genuine hope for the future. The summer weeks passed, sliding into early autumn. Grace grew larger with each passing day, and her energy waned as the baby demanded more of her resources. Rosa fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate enough and rested frequently. The older woman had become almost a mother figure, filling a void Grace had not realized was so empty. Her own mother had died when Grace was 12, and she had been on her own since she was 16, working whatever jobs she could find to survive. Having someone care about her well-being with no ulterior motive was a revelation. Frank sent letters to Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and several other towns, trying to track down circuit preacher Reynolds. In late September, he finally received a response. Reynolds was working in Tucson, Arizona, and would not return to New Mexico until early November. Frank immediately sent a letter explaining the situation and asking if Reynolds would be willing to provide testimony about Grace's marriage. Now there was nothing to do but wait. During this time, Grace found herself spending more time with Frank. He began eating lunch at the house instead of with the men, claiming he needed a break from their rough conversation. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Grace learned that Frank had wanted to be a teacher before his parents died, and the ranch became his responsibility. He loved books and would sometimes read to her in the evenings, his deep voice bringing poetry and adventure stories to life. She also discovered his kindness extended beyond her. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Tom, injured his hand badly in an accident with barbed wire. Frank not only paid for a doctor to come out from Santa Fe, but kept Tom on full wages while he recovered, finding him light work he could do one-handed. When Rosa's youngest daughter, who lived in Albuquerque, fell ill, Frank sent money for medicine and doctors without being asked. These acts were done quietly, without fanfare, but Grace noticed them all. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Grace's feelings began to shift. At first, she told herself it was simple gratitude, a natural fondness for someone who had helped her in her darkest hour. But as the weeks passed, she found herself listening for Frank's footsteps, looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that went beyond friendship. She noticed small things about him, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness of his hands when he helped her up from a chair, the sound of his laughter, rare but genuine, that made her heart skip a beat. It felt wrong to have such feelings. Samuel had been dead less than 6 months. She was carrying his child. What kind of woman developed affection for another man so soon? Grace tried to suppress these emerging emotions, reminding herself that Frank was simply being kind, that his concern was charitable rather than romantic. He had never done or said anything to suggest his feelings were anything more than friendly compassion. But sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and wondering that made her breath catch. And when their hands accidentally touched, passing dishes at dinner or reaching for the same book, she felt a spark that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with attraction. October brought cooler weather and the first hints of gold in the cottonwood trees. Grace was 7 months pregnant now, moving slowly and tiring easily. Rosa had begun preparing a room near the kitchen for the birth, gathering supplies and making plans. There was a midwife in a small settlement about 20 miles away, and Rosa sent word that her services would be needed in late November or early December. One afternoon, Grace was sitting on the porch, mending one of Frank's shirts when a rider approached. The man was well-dressed, too fine for a ranch hand, and he rode with the confidence of someone used to authority. Grace felt her stomach tighten with apprehension as he dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. "Is Frank Jameson available?" the man asked, his tone curt. "He's out with the cattle. He should be back by evening. Can I help you?" The man's eyes swept over her, taking in her pregnancy and simple dress. "You must be the woman from Placida's, Grace Wallace." "I am. I'm Robert Wallace, Samuel's brother, and I'm here to take you back to Placida's to face charges of fraud and theft." Grace's hands trembled, and she set down the mending before she dropped it. "I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice. I have a writ from the town council authorizing me to bring you back to answer for your crimes." Robert pulled a paper from his jacket and waved it at her. "You've been spreading lies about my brother, claiming a marriage that never existed, and now you're hiding out here, imposing on Mr. Jameson's hospitality under false pretenses." "Everything I said is true. Samuel and I were married, and this baby is his." "That's not what the town records show, and without proof, you're nothing but a confidence woman trying to steal property that belongs to me." Robert took a step toward the porch. "Now, are you going to come peacefully, or do I need to get the sheriff involved? You're not taking her anywhere." Frank's voice was hard as iron. Grace looked up to see him striding across the yard, his expression thunderous. Behind him, several ranch hands were emerging from the barn, alerted by the confrontation. Robert turned to face Frank. "Mr. Jameson, this is a legal matter. This woman is wanted in Placida's for fraud. I have the authority to bring her back. Show me this writ." Frank held out his hand. Robert hesitated, then handed over the paper. Frank read it carefully, his expression never changing. When he finished, he folded it deliberately and handed it back. "This document has no legal standing. The town council of Placida's has no authority to issue warrants or writs of any kind. Only a territorial judge can do that, and this bears no judicial seal. The town council has the right to investigate crimes within its jurisdiction. Perhaps. But they don't have the right to remove someone from private property against their will, especially someone under my protection." Frank moved to stand between Robert and the porch, his posture relaxed but ready. "Mrs. Wallace is a guest on my ranch, here of her own free will. She has committed no crime that I'm aware of, and I won't allow you to harass her. You don't know what you're getting involved in, Jameson. This woman is a liar and a thief. I know exactly what I'm getting involved in. I know that Samuel Wallace married Grace in October of 1877, with circuit preacher Thomas Reynolds performing the ceremony. I know that you, Robert Wallace, have been spreading false claims about your brother's widow in order to steal property that rightfully belongs to her. And I know that if you don't leave my property in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to have my men throw you off." Robert's face flushed red. "You're making a mistake. When this goes to court, you'll be implicated as an accessory to her fraud. I'll take my chances. Now get off my land." For a moment, Grace thought Robert might try to force the issue. His hand moved toward his hip, where a pistol was holstered, and the ranch hands behind Frank tensed. But then Robert seemed to reconsider, looking at the odds. He was one man against half a dozen, and Frank had the look of someone who knew how to handle himself in a fight. "This isn't over," Robert said, his voice low and threatening. "I'll get a real warrant, and next time you won't be able to hide behind property lines. I look forward to it. Maybe by then I'll have Circuit Preacher Reynolds here to testify that you're a liar and a thief." Frank's smile was cold. "See yourself out." Robert remounted his horse and rode off, spurring the animal harder than necessary. Grace watched him go, her whole body shaking with reaction. As soon as he was out of sight, her legs gave way, and she would have fallen if Frank had not bounded up the porch steps and caught her. "Easy now. He's gone. You're safe." Frank helped her to a chair and crouched beside her, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Rosa, bring some water." "I'm sorry," Grace managed through chattering teeth. "I'm sorry he came here, that he threatened you. None of this is your fault, and I'm not afraid of Robert Wallace or his empty threats." Frank took the water cup Rosa brought and held it to Grace's lips until she drank. "But this changes things. He's not going to let this go, and he clearly has influence in Placitas. We need to act faster." "How?" Grace's voice was small. "I'm going to Tucson. I'll find Reynolds and bring him back here to give testimony. With his word, we can take this to a territorial judge and get your marriage legally confirmed. That will undercut everything Robert is trying to do. But that's weeks of travel. You can't leave the ranch for that long. Miguel can manage things here. He's been running this place longer than I have." Frank's expression was determined. "I'm not going to let that man intimidate you, Grace. Not while I have breath in my body." Rosa placed a hand on Frank's arm. "And what if something happens while you're gone? The baby could come early." Grace could need protection if Robert returns. Frank frowned, clearly torn. "Then I'll hire someone to make the trip." "No," Grace found her voice stronger now. "You need to be here. Robert was trying to provoke you, trying to make you leave, so I'm more vulnerable. Don't give him that satisfaction. We'll wait for Reynolds to return in November like he said. It's only a few more weeks. And if Robert comes back with a real warrant, then we'll deal with it. But I won't have you abandoning your ranch and riding into danger on my account." Grace met his eyes. "Please, Frank, stay." The word hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Frank held her gaze for a long moment, and Grace saw something shift in his expression, a softening that made her pulse quicken. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll stay, but we need to be prepared. I'm going to send for a lawyer from Santa Fe, someone who can advise us on the legal situation. And I'm going to write to the territorial governor's office, explaining what's happening. Men like Robert Wallace get away with their schemes because people are too intimidated or too poor to fight back. Not this time." Over the next few days, Frank was true to his word. A lawyer named Harrison Pierce arrived from Santa Fe, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who listened carefully to Grace's story and examined what little documentation she had. He confirmed that without the circuit preacher's testimony or the original marriage certificate, her legal position was weak, but not hopeless. If Reynolds would testify, and if they could find other witnesses to the marriage ceremony, they had a reasonable chance of prevailing in territorial court. Pierce also brought troubling news. Robert Wallace had indeed filed a formal complaint in Placitas, accusing Grace of fraud and demanding her arrest. However, the territorial judge had declined to issue a warrant, noting that the evidence presented was insufficient, and that the matter appeared to be a civil dispute rather than a criminal one. This meant Grace was safe for now, but it also meant the battle would be fought in civil court, a lengthy and expensive process. "How much are we talking about?" Frank asked. Pierce named a figure that made Grace gasp. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, more than Samuel had earned in a year of hard mining work. "I can't ask you to spend that much," she said to Frank. "It's too much. I'll just let it go." "No." Frank's tone left no room for argument. We're doing this. I'll pay whatever it costs. But why? It's my fight, not yours. It stopped being just your fight the moment Robert Wallace came onto my land and threatened you. Frank leaned forward, his eyes intense. Grace, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this out of pity or charity. I'm doing this because it's right, and because I care about what happens to you. The air between them seemed to thicken. Rosa and Pierce had tactfully left the room, and Grace was suddenly very aware of being alone with Frank, of the way he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Frank, she began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. I know the timing is terrible. I know you're still grieving Samuel, and you're about to have his baby. I know I have no right to any expectations or hopes regarding your future. But I need you to know that over these past months, you've become important to me. Not as a charity case or a responsibility, but as a person I've come to admire and care for deeply. Whatever happens with this legal business, whatever you decide to do after the baby comes, I want you to know that you'll always have a home here. Not as a guest or an employee, but as someone I want in my life. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I have feelings for you, strong feelings, and I think maybe you might feel the same way. Frank's voice dropped. Am I wrong? She should say yes. She should laugh it off, protect both of them from the impossibility of the situation. Instead, Grace found herself saying, no, you're not wrong. Frank's expression lit up with something that looked like relief and joy combined. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that was both tender and thrilling. Then we'll figure this out, all of it. The legal mess, the baby, the future. Together, if you'll let me. It's complicated, Grace whispered. I'm pregnant with another man's child. A man I loved. I still love his memory. I know. And I would never ask you to forget Samuel or pretend he didn't matter. He was your husband and he'll always be the father of your child. I'm not trying to replace him. Frank squeezed her hand gently. But maybe in time there could be room in your heart for someone else too. I'm a patient man. I can wait. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. You're too good to me. I don't deserve this. Yes, you do. You deserve every good thing the world has to offer, and I intend to spend as long as you'll let me trying to give it to you. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply romantic. Grace's breath caught at the tenderness of it, at the promise implicit in that simple touch. They sat together for a long while, hands clasped, not speaking but communicating everything that mattered through their joined fingers and the weight of shared understanding. When Rosa finally returned, she took one look at them and smiled knowingly, but said nothing beyond announcing that dinner would be ready soon. That evening marked a turning point. Frank and Grace did not hide their growing affection from the household, though they were careful to be respectful given Grace's condition and her recent widowhood. Frank's attentions were gentle and courteous, never pushing beyond what Grace was comfortable with. He would offer his arm when she walked, pull out her chair at meals, bring her flowers from the wild blooms that grew near the creek. Small gestures, but each one felt precious to Grace, like stones building a bridge between her painful past and a potentially beautiful future. November arrived, bringing colder weather and the first dusting of snow on the mountain peaks. Grace was 8 months pregnant now, large and uncomfortable, with constant backaches and swollen feet. Rosa made her rest often, and Grace spent many afternoons in the main room, sitting by the fire with knitting or a book, while life on the ranch continued around her. Circuit Preacher Reynolds wrote to say he would arrive in Santa Fe in mid-November and would be happy to travel to the ranch to discuss Grace's situation. Frank immediately sent back a reply with travel funds and an invitation to stay as long as needed. The preacher's pending arrival brought both hope and anxiety. This would be Grace's chance to prove her marriage was legitimate, to reclaim Samuel's property and clear her name. But what if Reynolds did not remember her? What if Robert had somehow gotten to him first? Grace tried not to borrow trouble, focusing instead on the present. The baby was active now, rolling and kicking with vigor that sometimes took Grace's breath away. Rosa assured her this was a sign of a healthy, strong child, and Grace tried to take comfort in that. She had started making baby clothes, tiny gowns and blankets stitched with care during the long afternoon hours. Frank had commissioned a beautiful cradle from Miguel, who turned out to be a skilled carpenter, and it now sat in Grace's room, waiting for its occupant. One evening, as Grace sat by the fire working on a small quilt, Frank settled into the chair beside her. They had fallen into this comfortable routine, spending their evenings together while Rosa and Miguel retired early. Sometimes they talked, sometimes Frank read aloud, and sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence. "I've been thinking about something," Frank said, breaking the quiet. "What's that?" "After the baby comes, after we get the legal situation settled, what do you want to do? Stay here? Go somewhere else? You've never really talked about your plans." Grace set down her sewing. It was a question she had been avoiding, not wanting to examine too closely what the future might hold. "I don't know. I suppose I always assumed I would eventually move on, find work somewhere, raise my child as best I could. And now I don't want to leave." The admission came out quietly but firmly. "I've been happier here than anywhere else in my life. This feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has. But I know that can't last forever. Eventually, you'll want your space back, or you'll find someone to marry, and then it would be awkward for me to still be here." Frank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "What if I told you I've already found someone I want to marry?" Grace's heart stuttered. "Have you?" "Yes, but she's in a complicated situation and I'm trying to be patient while she figures things out." His eyes met hers, warm and steady. "Grace, I know it's too soon. I know you need time to grieve Samuel and adjust to being a mother. But I need you to know my intentions are serious. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Grace felt her eyes fill with tears. "You want to marry me? Even though I'm carrying another man's child, I want to marry you. The baby is part of you, which means I'll love him or her as my own. Samuel's child will grow up knowing their father was a good man who died too young, and they'll have me as a father in all the ways that matter, if you'll allow it." Grace was crying in earnest now, overwhelmed by emotion. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Say there's a possibility. That's all I need right now." Frank reached over and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "I love you, Grace. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you on that dusty road, so brave and determined even when the whole world had turned against you. And every day since then I've fallen a little harder." "I love you too," Grace whispered, the words escaping before she could think better of them. But once they were out, she realized how true they were. "I don't know when it happened. Part of me feels guilty, like I'm betraying Samuel's memory. But I can't deny what I feel. Loving again isn't a betrayal. It's a testament to your strength and your capacity for hope." Frank took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Samuel would want you to be happy. He would want his child to grow up in a loving home. And he would want you to find someone who would cherish you the way you deserve. How can you be so sure? Because if our positions were reversed, if I died and you moved on with someone else, I would hope you found someone who made you happy. Love isn't about possession. It's about wanting the best for the person you care about, even if you're not around to see it. Grace squeezed his hand. You're a remarkable man, Frank Jameson. I'm just a rancher who knows what he wants, he smiled. And what I want is you. In whatever time and whatever way you're ready to give. There's no rush, no pressure. We have all the time in the world. They sat together until the fire burned low, talking quietly about dreams and possibilities. Grace felt something she had not experienced since before Samuel's death. Not just hope, but genuine excitement for the future. The path forward was still uncertain, filled with legal battles and the challenge of new motherhood, but she would not be walking it alone. She had Frank beside her, solid and steady, offering not just protection but partnership and love. Circuit preacher Thomas Reynolds arrived on a cold afternoon in mid-November, riding a tired gray mare and looking every bit his 60-some years. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, and he embraced Grace like a long-lost daughter when she greeted him at the door. "Mrs. Wallace, my dear child, how wonderful to see you again, though I'm terribly sorry about the circumstances." Reynolds handed his hat to Rosa and accepted a cup of coffee gratefully. "Mr. Jameson explained something of your situation in his letters, a dreadful business." They settled in the main room, and Grace told her story once again, with Frank and lawyer Harrison Pierce listening carefully. Reynolds nodded throughout, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "I remember your wedding vividly," he said when Grace finished. "It was October 7, 1877, late afternoon at the small church in Placitas. You wore a blue dress, and Samuel gave you a ring that had belonged to his mother. The witnesses were Henry Collins, the blacksmith, and Martha Jennings, who ran the boarding house. I signed the marriage certificate and gave you a copy, as is my practice." "Do you keep records of the marriages you perform?" Pierce asked. "I do indeed. I have a ledger where I note every wedding, baptism, and funeral I conduct, with dates, names, and witnesses. It's back in my room in Santa Fe, but I can retrieve it easily enough." Reynolds frowned. "But surely the town records should show the marriage as well. I always advise the couples to register with the town clerk." "Samuel and I went to the clerk's office the next day," Grace said. "The clerk at the time was a man named Joseph Turner. He took our information and said he would record it in the official register. But Turner died last spring, and the new clerk claims there's no record of our marriage." "How convenient for Robert Wallace," Reynolds said dryly. "Tell me, who is the new clerk?" "Robert's cousin, David Wallace." "Ah, then I think we can assume the record was deliberately destroyed or hidden, a corruption of the very worst kind." Reynolds set down his coffee cup. "Well, my ledger should provide the proof you need. I'm willing to testify before any judge in the territory that I performed your marriage legally and properly." Pierce smiled. "With your testimony and your records, combined with the testimony of the original witnesses if they can be found, we should have more than enough to establish Mrs. Wallace's marriage beyond question." "Henry Collins died in a shooting earlier this year," Grace said sadly, "but Martha Jennings should still be in Placitas. She was always kind to me." "I'll travel to Placitas and speak with her," Frank said. "If she's willing to testify, I'll bring her here or arrange for her deposition." Over the next several days, plans came together. Reynolds returned to Santa Fe to retrieve his ledger, promising to return within a week. Frank made preparations to travel to Placitas, despite Grace's worry about him confronting Robert Wallace on his home territory. Pierce began drawing up the legal documents needed to file a claim in territorial court. But before any of this could fully unfold, Grace's water broke. It was early morning, just after dawn, and Grace had risen to use the privy. She made it back to her room before the cramping started, waves of pain that took her breath away. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The second contraction was stronger, dropping her to her knees, and this time she managed to cry out. Rosa was there in moments, taking one look at Grace before calling for Frank. Within minutes, the household was in controlled chaos. Rosa and Miguel took charge, settling Grace in the prepared room, sending one of the ranch hands for the midwife, and boiling water. Frank hovered anxiously until Rosa shooed him out, telling him he would be no help in the birthing room. The labor was long and difficult. Grace had no experience with childbirth, no mother or sisters to have told her what to expect, and the pain was beyond anything she could have imagined. Rosa coached her through each contraction, offering water and encouragement, but hours blurred together in a haze of agony. The midwife, a competent woman named Sarah Green, arrived by mid-morning and took over with brisk efficiency. She examined Grace and declared everything was progressing normally, though it would likely be a while yet. "First babies take their time," she said. "Just breathe through the pains and push when I tell you." Outside, Frank paced the main room like a caged animal, unable to sit still or focus on anything. Miguel tried to distract him with ranch business, but Frank waved him off. He had been through difficult things in his life, but waiting while Grace suffered beyond the closed door was a unique form of torture. He prayed, something he had not done regularly since his parents died, bargaining with God to keep Grace and the baby safe. Afternoon faded to evening. Miguel brought food that Frank could not eat. The sounds from the birthing room grew more intense, Grace's cries cutting through Frank's heart like knives. He wanted to go to her to offer comfort, but Rosa had been firm. This was women's work, and he would only be in the way. Finally, as the sun was setting, a new sound joined the chorus. A baby's cry, thin and outraged at being forced into the cold world. Frank froze, hardly daring to breathe. The crying continued, strong and healthy, and he felt his knees go weak with relief. Rosa emerged a few minutes later, tired but smiling. "It's a boy, a big, healthy boy with good lungs, and Grace is fine, exhausted but fine. You can see them in a few minutes after we get them cleaned up." Frank found himself blinking back tears. Thank God they're both all right." "Grace is asking for you." When Frank was finally allowed into the room, he found Grace propped up in bed, pale and exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets, just a small face visible among the folds. The baby's eyes were closed, but his mouth moved in little sucking motions, and one perfect tiny hand had worked free of the wrapping. "Frank," Grace said softly, "come meet him." Frank approached slowly, almost reverently. He had never been this close to a newborn before and was struck by how impossibly small and fragile the baby looked. "He's beautiful. He looks like Samuel." "I think so too." Grace's voice was tired but content. "I'm going to name him Samuel Thomas Wallace, after his father and the preacher who helped us. Samuel Thomas for his whole name, but we'll call him Thomas for every day. That way he'll have his own identity but still honor his father." "Thomas, I like that." Frank gently touched the baby's tiny hand, and to his amazement, the little fingers curled around his own. The gesture went straight to his heart. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." Grace watched Frank with her son, and something in her heart settled into place. The way Frank looked at Thomas with such tenderness and wonder told her everything she needed to know about what kind of father he would be. "Would you like to hold him? I don't want to drop him." "You won't. Here, sit down." Grace guided Frank through the process of taking the baby, showing him how to support the head and cradle the small body against his chest. Frank held Thomas like he was made of glass, his large, work-roughened hands impossibly gentle. Thomas opened his eyes then, unfocused but searching, and seemed to look right at Frank. For a moment the baby's fussing stopped and he appeared to be studying this new person. Then his face screwed up and he began to cry. "What did I do?" Frank asked, panicked. Grace laughed softly. "Nothing. He's just hungry. Here, give him back." Rosa showed Grace how to nurse, and after a few fumbling attempts, Thomas latched on and began feeding. Grace looked down at her son, overwhelmed with love and protectiveness. This tiny person was depending on her completely, and she was responsible for keeping him safe and helping him grow. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. Frank stayed with them until Rosa insisted Grace needed rest. He left reluctantly, but not before pressing a gentle kiss to Grace's forehead. "You did amazingly. I'm so proud of you. Thank you for being here, for everything." Grace caught his hand. "I mean it, Frank. I don't know how I would have gotten through any of this without you. You're stronger than you know, but I'm glad I could be here." He looked down at Thomas, now sleeping in Grace's arms. "He's lucky to have you as his mother, and I promise you both I'll do everything in my power to give you the best life possible." After Frank left, Grace lay awake for a long time, watching Thomas sleep. She thought about Samuel, wishing he could have met his son, wishing things had been different. But she also thought about Frank, about his steadiness and kindness, about the way he had looked at Thomas with such instant love. Samuel would approve, she thought. He would want his son to have a good man to look up to, and he would want Grace to find happiness again. "Your daddy would have loved you so much," Grace whispered to the sleeping baby. "He was a good man, and I'll make sure you know all about him as you grow up. But Frank is going to be there too if I have anything to say about it, and he's going to be a wonderful father to you. You're a lucky boy, Thomas. You're going to have the love of two good men, even though one of them is watching from heaven." Thomas stirred in his sleep, making soft baby noises, and Grace felt her heart expand with love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever legal battles still needed to be fought, she had her son and she had Frank. That was enough. That was everything. The days following Thomas's birth were a blur of feedings and diaper changes and exhaustion. Grace had never been so tired in her life, but the baby brought a joy that made the sleepless nights worthwhile. Frank was a constant presence, checking on them several times a day, bringing small gifts for Thomas, and helping with whatever tasks Grace would allow. He was clearly smitten with the baby, often holding Thomas while Grace ate or rested, speaking to him in a soft voice about the ranch and the horses, and all the things they would do together when Thomas was older. Rosa was invaluable, teaching Grace how to care for an infant and taking Thomas for a few hours each day so Grace could sleep. Miguel carved a set of small wooden toys, and even the ranch hands made excuses to peek in at the baby, their rough exteriors softening at the sight of the tiny life. Circuit Preacher Reynolds returned a week after Thomas's birth, his ledger in hand. The entry for October 7, 1877, clearly recorded the marriage of Samuel Wallace to Grace Porter, with the names of the witnesses and Reynolds's signature. Pierce examined the ledger carefully and declared it would stand up in court. "This is excellent," the lawyer said. "Combined with Reverend Reynolds's testimony, we have a strong case. Now we just need to locate Martha Jennings and secure her deposition." Frank prepared to travel to Placida's, but before he could leave, Martha Jennings appeared at the ranch herself. She was a stout, motherly woman in her 50s, and she embraced Grace with tears in her eyes. "I heard about what Robert Wallace has been doing, and I couldn't stand by any longer," Martha said. "I was at your wedding. I saw the preacher sign the certificate. I watched you and Samuel exchange vows, and there was nothing false about it. Robert is lying, and I'm prepared to say so to anyone who will listen." With Martha's arrival, All the pieces fell into place. Pierce filed a petition in territorial court in Santa Fe, presenting Reynolds's ledger, his testimony, and Martha's sworn statement. The judge reviewed the evidence and, within a week, issued a ruling confirming that Grace had been legally married to Samuel Wallace, and that Thomas was his legitimate heir. The ruling also ordered Robert Wallace to surrender all property and possessions belonging to Samuel's estate to Grace immediately. Robert tried to fight the ruling, claiming fraud and conspiracy, but without any evidence to support his claims, his arguments fell flat. The territorial judge was unimpressed with Robert's behavior and issued a stern warning that any further harassment of Grace would result in legal consequences. The victory was sweet, but bittersweet. Grace had her name cleared and her son's inheritance secured, but it could not bring Samuel back or undo the pain of the past months. Still, it was closure, a legal affirmation of what Grace had always known to be true. She was Samuel's widow, Thomas was his son, and they had every right to the life Samuel had worked to build. With the legal matters settled, Grace had to decide what to do with Samuel's property. The cabin in Placitas held too many painful memories, and she had no desire to return to a town that had treated her so cruelly. After much thought, she decided to sell the cabin and the small plot of land it sat on, using the money to establish a trust for Thomas's future. It was not a fortune, but it would help pay for his education when the time came. As winter settled in fully, Grace found herself thinking more and more about Frank's proposal. Thomas was 6 weeks old now, a chubby, healthy baby who was starting to smile and make cooing sounds. Grace was recovering from the birth, her strength slowly returning. And every day she watched Frank with her son and fell a little more in love. One evening in late December, after putting Thomas to bed, Grace found Frank in the main room, going over ledgers by lamplight. She sat down across from him, her heart pounding with nerves. "Can we talk?" Frank immediately set aside his work. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "No, but there's something I need to say." Grace took a deep breath. "You asked me a question a few weeks ago about what I wanted for the future. About whether I would consider marrying you, I remember." Frank's expression was carefully neutral, but Grace could see hope flickering in his eyes. "I've thought about it a lot, and I've realized something. I love you, Frank. Not just because you saved me, or because you've been kind to Thomas and me, but because of who you are. You're good and honest and strong, and you make me want to be better. You make me believe in the possibility of happiness again." "Grace," Frank said softly, reaching across to take her hand. "Let me finish. I know it hasn't been very long since Samuel died. Some people would say it's too soon, that I should wait longer before moving on. But life is short and uncertain. Samuel taught me that, and I don't want to waste time being afraid of what people might think. I want to build a life with you if the offer is still open." Frank was on his feet in an instant, pulling Grace up and into his arms. "The offer is always open, forever if that's what it takes." He held her close, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Grace Wallace. I love you and Thomas both, and I promise I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision." Grace tilted her face up, and Frank kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet, full of promise and restrained passion. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "So that's a yes?" Frank asked, his eyes dancing with joy. "That's a yes. I'll marry you, Frank Jameson, as soon as you want. Tomorrow wouldn't be too soon for me, but I suppose we should do things properly." Frank laughed, the sound full of relief and happiness. "Maybe in the spring, when the weather is better and we can have a real celebration. That will give Thomas time to grow a bit more too." "Spring sounds perfect." They told Rosa and Miguel the next morning, and both were delighted. Rosa immediately began planning, talking about dresses and flowers and food. Miguel clapped Frank on the back and told him he was a lucky man. Word spread among the ranch hands, and there were congratulations all around. The winter months passed in a haze of contentment. Grace continued to heal and regain her strength, while Thomas grew rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive with each passing day. Frank was a devoted almost father, learning to change diapers and soothe the baby when he fussed, reading stories to Thomas even though the infant was far too young to understand. Watching Frank with her son made Grace's heart swell with love. In early February, Grace made a decision. She asked Frank if they could visit Samuel's grave in Placitas before the wedding. She wanted to say a proper goodbye, to tell Samuel about Frank and Thomas, and to ask his blessing, even though she knew he could not answer. Frank agreed immediately and arranged for them to make the trip on a mild day when the roads were clear. They brought Thomas, bundled warmly against the cold, and rode together in a wagon. Rosa and Miguel came along for support, and Lawyer Pierce joined them in case there were any lingering legal issues to address. The town of Placitas looked smaller than Grace remembered, less threatening in the clear winter light. A few people stared as they passed, and Grace saw Robert Wallace watching from the porch of the saloon, his expression sour. But no one approached or caused trouble, perhaps intimidated by Frank's presence and the official court documents Pierce carried. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the town, with scattered cottonwood trees providing shade. Samuel's grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, and Grace was touched to see that someone had kept the area clear of weeds. Perhaps Martha Jennings, who had proven herself a true friend. Grace knelt by the grave, with Thomas in her arms and Frank standing respectfully a few feet back. She told Samuel everything that had happened, about Robert's betrayal, about finding safety at Frank's ranch, about Thomas's birth and how beautiful their son was. She told him about Frank, about falling in love again, about the plans to marry in the spring. "I hope you understand," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I hope you know that loving Frank doesn't mean I've forgotten you. You'll always be my first love, and Thomas will grow up knowing about his brave father who died too young. But I'm still alive, and I have to keep living. And I want to do that with Frank if you'll give us your blessing." The wind picked up, rustling through the bare branches of the cottonwoods, and Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. She did not believe in ghosts or signs from beyond, but in that moment, she felt certain that Samuel approved. He had loved her and wanted her happiness. He would want his son to have a good father. He would understand. Frank came forward and crouched beside Grace, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I promise I'll take good care of them," he said quietly to the grave. "I'll love your son like he's my own, and I'll make sure he knows about you, about the good man you were. Thank you for loving Grace and giving her Thomas. I'll try to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me." They stayed for a little while longer, then said their final goodbyes and returned to the wagon. Grace felt lighter somehow, as if she had been carrying a weight she had not fully acknowledged. She had closed one chapter of her life and was ready to begin the next. As they drove out of Placitas, Grace did not look back. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in April, and preparations consumed the ranch for weeks beforehand. Rosa sewed Grace a beautiful dress of cream-colored silk, simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery around the neckline. Miguel and the ranch hands cleaned and painted the barn for the reception, and Frank ordered special food and drink from Santa Fe. Invitations were sent to neighbors, friends, and the few family members Frank had scattered across the territory. Circuit Preacher Reynolds agreed to perform the ceremony, traveling from Santa Fe for the occasion. Martha Jennings came as well, along with several other people from Placitas who had been friends to Grace and Samuel. Robert Wallace was notably absent, and Grace was grateful for that small mercy. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with wildflowers blooming across the hillsides and a warm breeze carrying the scent of spring. Grace woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent time nursing and playing with Thomas. He was 4 months old now, a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and was just starting to laugh. He would be carried by Rosa during the ceremony, a tiny witness to his mother's new beginning. Rosa helped Grace dress, arranging her hair and placing a wreath of wildflowers on her head. When Grace looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked happy, she realized. Not just content or resigned, but genuinely joyful. The haunted, desperate woman who had fled Placitas 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more hopeful. The ceremony took place in the afternoon, under the cottonwood trees near the creek. Chairs had been set up for the guests, and an archway covered in flowers marked where Grace and Frank would exchange their vows. As Grace walked toward Frank, she saw him waiting for her, dressed in his finest suit, and the look on his face took her breath away. He was gazing at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, like he could not believe his good fortune. Frank took her hands when she reached him, and they turned together to face Circuit Preacher Reynolds. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with traditional vows and readings. When it came time for the rings, Frank slipped a gold band onto Grace's finger, and she did the same for him. Reynolds pronounced them husband and wife, and Frank kissed her gently, mindful of their audience but unable to hide his joy. The celebration that followed was lively and warm. There was music and dancing, abundant food, and many toasts to the happy couple. Grace danced with Frank, with Miguel, and even with Lawyer Pierce, who had become a good friend through the legal ordeal. Thomas was passed from person to person, enjoying the attention, and Frank kept finding excuses to retrieve his new son and hold him close. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Grace and Frank slipped away from the party for a few minutes alone. They walked to a rise overlooking the ranch, where they could see the lights being lit in the barn and hear the distant sound of laughter and music. "Happy?" Frank asked, his arm around Grace's waist. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," Grace admitted. "Thank you, Frank, for everything. For saving me, for protecting me, for loving me and Thomas. You've given us a life I never dreamed possible. You've given me a family," Frank replied. "This ranch was just a place before you came. Now it's a home. You and Thomas are everything I never knew I needed." They stood together as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars emerge one by one. Below them, the celebration continued, but up here, it was just the two of them and the vast, beautiful night. "You think we'll have more children?" Grace asked softly. "If we're blessed. I'd love to give Thomas siblings, a whole house full of kids running around causing chaos." Frank smiled. "But whether we do or not, we already have everything that matters. We have each other and we have Thomas. That's more than enough." Grace leaned into him, feeling safe and loved and full of hope. The journey that had begun in fear and desperation had led her here, to this man and this moment. She thought about all the twists and turns, the pain and loss that had brought her to Frank's ranch. She would not wish those experiences on anyone, but she could not regret them entirely, because they had led her to this happiness. "I love you, Frank Jameson," she said. "I love you too, Grace Jameson." Frank's arms tightened around her, always and forever. They returned to the party hand in hand, ready to celebrate with their friends and family, ready to begin their married life together. And high above, the stars shone down on them, bright and constant, like a promise that despite all the darkness life could bring, there would always be light to guide the way home. The years that followed were full and rich. Grace threw herself into life as a rancher's wife, learning to manage the household accounts, to preserve food for the long winters, to tend the garden that grew larger each year. She made friends among the neighboring ranches and became known for her kindness and good sense. The women who had once shunned her in Placitas would have been amazed to see her now, confident and capable, surrounded by respect and affection. Thomas grew from a baby to a toddler to a bright, energetic little boy. He had Samuel's dark hair and Grace's green eyes, and he adored Frank, following him around the ranch and asking endless questions. Frank was endlessly patient, teaching Thomas about horses and cattle, about the land and how to care for it. To anyone who saw them together, Thomas was clearly Frank's son in every way that mattered. When Thomas was 2 years old, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Lily Rose Jameson. She had Frank's dark eyes and Grace's smile, and she was a calm, sweet-natured baby from the start. Thomas was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything and constantly checking to make sure she was all right. Frank was besotted, carrying Lily around the ranch and showing her off to anyone who would look. 2 years after Lily came another son, Daniel Frank Jameson. Daniel was loud and energetic from birth, keeping Grace and Frank on their toes. But the chaos he brought was joyful, and the house rang with laughter and noise in a way that made Grace's heart full. As the children grew, Grace made sure Thomas knew about his birth father. She told him stories about Samuel, about his strength and kindness, about how much he would have loved his son. Frank supported this completely, never trying to erase Samuel's memory or make Thomas forget his origins. On the anniversary of Samuel's death each year, they would all visit his grave together, bringing flowers and teaching the younger children about the man who had made Thomas possible. Thomas never felt less than a full member of the family. Frank adopted him legally when he was 5, giving him the Jameson name alongside Wallace, so he was Thomas Wallace Jameson. But Frank never asked Thomas to stop honoring Samuel, and as Thomas grew older, he came to appreciate having 2 fathers, one who had given him life and one who had given him everything else. The ranch prospered under Frank's careful management. He expanded the operation gradually, buying more land and increasing the herd. But he was always fair to his workers, paying well and treating everyone with respect. Men wanted to work for Frank Jameson, and the ranch gained a reputation as one of the best-run operations in the territory. Grace's trust fund for Thomas grew as well, carefully invested by lawyer Pierce, who had become a close family friend. By the time Thomas was ready for college, there would be more than enough to send him anywhere he wanted to go, but those days were far in the future. For now, Grace's life was full of the everyday joys of family. Teaching Lily to bake bread, watching Daniel take his first steps, helping Thomas with his reading lessons. Evening meals gathered around the big kitchen table, with Rosa and Miguel often joining them, the children chattering and Frank and Grace exchanging amused glances over their heads. In 1885, 7 years after their wedding, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time she was less anxious, having been through it before and knowing what to expect. The birth was easier than Thomas's had been, and she delivered a healthy boy they named Samuel James Jameson, after Thomas's birth father and Frank's father. Little Samuel, who they called Jamie to avoid confusion, had red hair like no one in either family could account for, and a mischievous streak a mile wide. With 4 children, the house was constantly busy and occasionally chaotic. But Frank and Grace thrived on it, working together as a team to manage the household and the ranch. On quieter evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit together on the porch, talking about their day, planning for the future, simply enjoying each other's company. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked one such evening when they had been married nearly 10 years. "Back when you first found me on that road, did you think it would lead to this?" Frank considered the question. "I knew I wanted to help you, and I knew I found you interesting even then. But no, I didn't imagine all of this." He gestured to the house behind them where their children slept. "I didn't let myself imagine it because it seemed too much to hope for, but I'm grateful every day that it turned out this way." "So am I." Grace leaned against him. "I was so scared back then. I thought my life was over, that I would lose everything. I never dreamed I could be this happy." "You've earned it. You're the strongest person I know, Grace. The way you fought for yourself and Thomas, the way you built a new life from nothing. You inspire me. We did it together." "I couldn't have survived without you." Grace looked up at him. "You're my hero, Frank Jameson. You rode up when I needed someone most and said I was under your protection. You've been protecting me ever since, but more than that, you've been loving me. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Frank kissed her softly. "And you've given me a family, a real home, a purpose beyond just running the ranch. You and the children are my whole world." They sat together as the stars came out, the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night around them. Inside, they could hear one of the children cry out briefly in sleep, then settle again. Their life was not perfect. There were still challenges and hard days, but it was good. It was so very good. As the years continued to pass, the children grew and changed. Thomas became a serious, studious boy who loved books as much as ranching. At 12, he was tall for his age and showing signs of the fine man he would become. Frank taught him to handle responsibility, giving him small jobs around the ranch and gradually increasing his duties as he proved himself capable. Lily was 9 now, a gentle soul who loved animals and spent hours caring for the baby calves and colts. She had Grace's compassion and Frank's quiet strength, and everyone who met her was charmed by her sweet nature. Daniel at 7 was all energy and mischief, constantly getting into scrapes and needing to be rescued from trees or wells or the barn loft. But his heart was good, and he idolized his older brother, following Thomas everywhere and trying to do everything Thomas did. Jamie at 4 was the baby of the family, spoiled by everyone and ruling the household with his infectious laughter and charm. He had Grace wrapped around his little finger and knew it, but Frank was working on teaching him that charm would only get him so far. In 1889, tragedy struck the family when Rosa fell ill. She had been more than an employee to Grace, more even than a friend. She had been a second mother, a teacher, a constant source of wisdom and support. Grace spent weeks at Rosa's bedside, doing everything she could to nurse the older woman back to health, but Rosa had lived a long, full life, and her body was simply wearing out. On a quiet morning in early summer, Rosa passed away peacefully in her sleep, with Miguel holding one hand and Grace holding the other. Miguel was devastated, having been married to Rosa for over 40 years. Grace and Frank did everything they could to comfort him, but grief was a burden each person had to carry alone. They buried Rosa on a hill overlooking the ranch she had loved, and the entire community turned out for the funeral. Grace delivered a eulogy, speaking through tears about how Rosa had taken her in, taught her everything she knew about running a household, and loved her children like they were her own grandchildren. There was not a dry eye in attendance. Miguel aged visibly after Rosa's death, becoming quieter and more withdrawn. But he continued working on the ranch, saying it was what Rosa would have wanted. He took comfort in spending time with the children, teaching them the skills Rosa had taught him, passing on her recipes and stories. And gradually, though the grief never fully left, he learned to smile again. Life continued as it always does. Thomas turned 15 and began talking seriously about what he wanted to do with his future. He was interested in studying law, inspired by Harrison Pierce, who still visited regularly and had become like an uncle to the children. Frank encouraged this dream, promising that Thomas would have the education he needed to achieve it. "But I'll always be a rancher at heart," Thomas assured his father one day as they were working together. "This place is part of me. Even if I become a lawyer, I'll always want to come back here." "You can be both," Frank said. "You can have a law practice and still help run the ranch. The two aren't mutually exclusive, and knowing the law will help you protect the ranch and our family better." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Did you ever regret not becoming a teacher like you wanted?" "Sometimes. But life takes us where we need to go, not always where we think we want to go. And I've learned more from running this ranch and raising you kids than I ever would have in a classroom. So no, I don't regret it. My life turned out exactly as it was meant to." In the summer of 1892, when Grace was 33 years old, she discovered she was pregnant again. It was unexpected. She had thought they were done having children, but not unwelcome. Frank was delighted at the prospect of another baby, and the children were excited to have a new sibling. The pregnancy was easier than any of Grace's previous ones, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps simply because her body had done this before. When the time came, in early 1893, she delivered twin girls they named Rose Alina and Alina Rose, swapping the names at the last minute because they could not decide which baby should have which name. The twins were identical, with dark curls and gray eyes, and telling them apart became a family game. With 6 children, the household was busier than ever. Thomas at 16 was a huge help, mature enough to watch his younger siblings when needed. Lily at 13 was almost a second mother to the twins, constantly wanting to help care for them. Even Daniel and Jamie, at 10 and 8, found ways to contribute. Grace sometimes felt overwhelmed by the sheer number of people depending on her, but Frank was always there, ready to take over when she needed a break or to work as a team to get through the chaos. They had learned over the years to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's needs, to support each other through challenges. Their love had matured from the passionate romance of their early days into something deeper and more enduring, a partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering commitment. The ranch continued to thrive. Frank took on a partner, a young man named Joseph Miller who showed promise and dedication. This gave Frank more time to spend with his growing family, a luxury he appreciated deeply. He taught the boys to ride and rope, to repair fences and care for cattle. He taught the girls that they could do anything their brothers could, encouraging Lily when she wanted to learn ranching skills and praising Rose and Alina's fearless attempts to keep up with their older siblings. In 1895, Thomas left for college in California, planning to study law. It was hard on the entire family, particularly Grace, who cried for a week after his departure. But they had raised him to chase his dreams, and she was proud of the young man he had become. He promised to write often and come home for holidays, and he kept that promise faithfully. Life settled into new rhythms with Thomas away. The younger children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and interests. Lily showed a talent for healing, tending injured animals with skill and compassion. Daniel wanted to be a cowboy, riding the range and living wild and free. Jamie was fascinated by the stories Miguel told and announced he wanted to travel the world. Rose and Alina, still small, were content to simply be together, mirror images of each other in appearance and temperament. Grace was 37 when Miguel died peacefully in his sleep, joining his beloved Rosa at last. The family grieved deeply for the man who had been part of their lives for so long, who had taught them so much and loved them so well. They buried him next to Rosa on the hillside, and planted a tree between their graves, an oak that would grow strong and provide shade for decades to come. The years rolled on, marked by graduations and birthdays, by holidays and harvest times, by the everyday joys and sorrows that make up a life. Thomas graduated from law school and returned home to open a practice in Santa Fe, specializing in property law and women's rights. He never married, claiming he was married to his work, though Grace suspected he had simply not found the right person yet. Lily married a veterinarian at 21 and moved to Albuquerque, where she helped run his practice and raised horses on the side. Daniel did indeed become a cowboy, working ranches throughout the West and sending letters full of adventure. Jamie went to college back east, studying literature and history, fulfilling his dream of seeing the world. The twins, as they moved through their teenage years, showed no signs of wanting to leave the ranch. They helped Frank run the operation with skill and enthusiasm, proving that women could be as capable as men at any task. Frank was immensely proud of them, his late-life daughters who reminded him every day of the blessing that was his family. In 1905, Grace and Frank celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary. They had been through so much together, built so much, loved so deeply. Their hair was graying now, and they moved a little slower than they used to, but the bond between them was as strong as ever. They sat together on the porch on their anniversary evening, in the same spot where they had sat so many times over the years. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and beautiful, a testament to their hard work and dedication. "You ever think about that day I found you on the road?" Frank asked. "About how different things might have been if I had ridden past." "Sometimes," Grace admitted, "but I try not to dwell on alternate paths. This is the life I have, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. You saved me that day, Frank, not just from dying in the desert, but from despair. You gave me hope when I had none, and you've been giving me that gift ever since. You saved me too, from a life that was just work and routine. You gave me love and family and purpose. Everything good in my life comes from you." Grace took his hand, fingers interlacing with familiar ease. "We saved each other then, and we built something beautiful together, something that will last long after we're gone." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Inside the house, Rose and Alina were preparing dinner, their voices carrying out in cheerful conversation. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and a horse whinnied. The sounds of home, the sounds of a life well lived. "I love you, Grace," Frank said softly. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you, fierce and frightened and trying so hard to be brave. And I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Frank Jameson, my protector, my partner, my greatest love. Thank you for choosing me, for standing by me, for building this beautiful life with me." They kissed as the stars began to emerge, a gentle press of lips that held decades of love and devotion. And as night fell over the ranch, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her here. About Samuel, whose loss had seemed like the end of everything, but had really been a painful transition to something new. About Thomas, the son who had forced her to keep going when she wanted to give up. About Frank, who had ridden up on that dusty road and offered protection that had blossomed into the greatest love of her life. She thought about Rosa and Miguel, about Martha Jennings and Circuit Preacher Reynolds and all the people who had helped along the way. about the children she had raised and the grandchildren who were starting to arrive, about the full, rich life that had grown from the ashes of her darkest moment, and she was grateful for all of it. The pain and the joy, the loss and the love, the fear and the hope. Because it had all led to this, to Frank's hand in hers and a home full of love and a future bright with possibility. The stars shone down on them, ancient and constant, and Grace smiled. Her story, which had begun with stones and dust and exile, had become one of love and family and triumph. She was Grace Jameson, wife and mother, survivor and fighter, beloved and blessed beyond measure. And she lived happily, surrounded by love for all the days of her life. When she finally passed at the ripe age of 78, with Frank holding her hand just as he had on so many evenings before, she went peacefully, her heart full of contentment. Frank followed 3 years later, and they were buried together on the hillside overlooking the ranch they had built, their names carved into a single stone. Their children and grandchildren continued their legacy, running the ranch and living lives guided by the values Grace and Frank had instilled. The story of the pregnant widow who had been chased from town, and the rancher who had offered her protection and love, became family legend, told to each new generation as a reminder of the power of kindness, courage, and enduring love. And the ranch thrived on, a testament to the fact that from the darkest moments can grow the brightest futures, and that true love, when found, can transform everything.